Chapter 18. Fantasia. It was a hard-run chase, the madman darting and leaping between the boulders and crags with astonishing agility. Many times he seemed to vanish entirely, only to suddenly reappear 100 yards ahead. Still I pressed on, sticking doggedly on his tail as he fled deeper and deeper into the hinterland. Suddenly he came to a halt, and only by diving behind a boulder did I manage to avoid his gaze. I watched as he crouched beneath a rock shelf and laid the wooden plank before him, connecting it to 2 wires, one snaking up the hillside behind him, the other to a steel peg driven into the ground. Then he donned the headphones, reached into the tangle of wires covering the plank, and fell very still. Long, silent minutes passed as he knelt before the crude contraption, brow knitted in concentration. Occasionally he glanced up with a start, hand flying to his ear, only to sigh dejectedly and resume his silent ritual. On it went, my excitement swiftly ebbing as I realized the futility of his efforts. I had hoped to use the radio to navigate back to civilization, but seeing this Heath Robinson contraption up close, it soon became clear it would never work. Pale truly was mad, driven to elaborate flights of fancy. As I quietly slipped away, I prayed I could make good my escape before I myself was reduced to such a state. But suddenly Pale let out a sharp cry, and whirling around I saw him sitting bolt upright, mouth agape, as if he'd just been struck by lightning. His trembling hand slowly rose to his ear as the corners of his mouth crept into a crazed grin. Then he began to laugh, a manic laugh of pure, unfettered joy. Impossible, I thought. Had Piao actually managed to construct a working receiver, or was this just another delusion, the confabulation of a shattered mind? Though desperate to find out, I had not forgotten that this man had killed Jacques, a man twice his size, with his bare hands. So I ducked back behind the boulder and waited, hoping he would soon tire and wander off. But Piao remained crouched under the shelf for what seemed like an age, hand pressed to his ear as he chuckled contentedly to himself. To the west the sun had already fallen halfway to the horizon. It would be dusk soon. I had to rejoin Ivan and Thierry before they took off without me. With growing impatience, I rooted through the haversack I had inadvertently carried with me, pulling out the shaving kit, a handful of tattered books, a dozen tins of gauze and sticking plasters, and a pair of military identity discs on a chain. But it was the last item I found, a small metal wash basin, that set my mind racing. Thinking back to the night of the Richelieu's run up the Straits of Gibraltar, an idea suddenly came to me. Basin in one hand, a rock in the other, I slowly rose and crept towards Pierre, hoping against hope that my plan would work. For if it did not, I would soon be running for my life. I managed to creep within a foot of Pierre before I brought the rock crashing down into the basin. Pierre sprang into the air, nearly dashing his head against the cave roof, before scrambling to his feet in a hurricane of flailing limbs and fleeing into the hills. Sighing with relief, I ducked under the shelf and knelt before the radio, which was even cruder than I had imagined. Screwed to the plank was a short wire coil, a razor blade, and a safety pin with a short length of pencil lead fixed to its end, bent so the lead barely touched the surface of the blade. Aside from the headphones, aerial, and earthing wire, there was nothing else to it. Curious, I pressed the earphones to my ear, and my jaw dropped. Though nearly drowned out by the crackling static, the unmistakable patter of human voices could be heard, intercut with faint strings of Morse code. I could hardly believe it. The damn thing worked. Wasting no time, I began packing the contraption away into the haversack. Ne touchez pas! I glanced up with a start to see Piao looming over me, a pistol clutched in his trembling hand. My hand flew for the basin, but before I could reach it, he jammed the barrel against my head. Get up, he growled. Get away! I raised my hands and rose to my feet, and as I slowly backed away, I got my first proper look at Pierre Doré. He was a ragged skeleton of a man, pale and sallow-skinned from untold months locked in that dark cell. Yet under the hollow cheeks and filthy matted hair there remained traces of the square jaw and Grecian nose he shared with his brother Stéphane. But the eyes, those were terrifying to behold. They were the same eyes I'd seen staring from the depths of the Citadel dungeon, sunken, haunted. Eyes that had never known rest. Indeed, his whole body seemed never to rest, twitching and jerking like he'd been wired to a dynamo. Nervously I eyed his finger as it danced on the trigger. There was no use running. He could empty the pistol into me before I could even turn around. So I continued to back up, eyes downcast. Stop there, said Pierre. Who are you? Edward. Edward who? Edward Hawkins. Pierre's eyes narrowed to slits. Don't fool me, you filthy bush. What's your real name? It's Edward. Like I said, Edward Hawkins. Do you think I'm stupid? Wie heißen Sie? I gaped at him dumbly. What was your mission, he hissed. To disrupt our communications? Sprechen! Schnell! Having no answer to give him, I tried instead to change the subject. You built this, I said, gesturing to the radio. Yes, what of it? Piao snapped. It's incredible, I said. I've never seen a wireless like that. How does it work? But this flattery had no effect. Piao was taut as a bowstring, his teeth grinding loudly. Who are you? Why did they send you? They didn't, I said. I'm a prisoner like you, like Ivan and Thierry. Please, how do you know those names? I knew it, you're a spy. No, I told you I'm Edward from the Richelieu. I don't know who that is. Who are you? I made to speak again, but it was no use. The man was shaking and quivering like an overheated boiler ready to burst. There was no stopping it, nothing to be done. Nothing but to run and pray that shaking hands would once again miss their mark. Sprechen, he cried. Tell me or I'll blow your... Suddenly he fell silent and cocked his head to the side. His eyes dropped to the ground, to my feet dancing their terrified jig beneath me. After a moment he slowly reached out his hand to the rock face and rapped his knuckles on the stone. Qui êtes-vous? He tapped. Who are you? With trembling hands that stubbornly resisted my command, I reached out and tapped a reply. Edward Hawkins. I know you, Piao muttered with knitted brow. How do I know you? For a moment I returned to that bare little cell in the hole of the Richelieu, with its whitewashed walls, single light bulb, and the faint tapping ringing down the steam pipe. Il fait noir, I tapped. As though a switch had been thrown, the man before me was instantly transformed. The fire and fury vanished from his face, leaving only the wide, watery eyes of a frightened child. Yes, he said, nodding to himself. You were in the hole too, and... He glanced up at me with an astonished smile. You let me go, he said. That was you, wasn't it? You set me free. Yes, I said, breathing a sigh of relief. Like a man suddenly awakened from a dream, Pierre glanced about him in confusion. When his gaze fell upon the pistol in his hand, he dropped it as if it had suddenly become red hot. Oh, God, he muttered, sheepishly averting his eyes. I'm sorry, Thank you, Edward. Come with me. He turned and stumbled off around the corner, beckoning me to follow. I hesitated, knowing I should rejoin Ivan and Thierry, but once again my curiosity got the better of me, and I followed him around the corner. There I encountered a truly unexpected sight. A tidy little campsite laid out beneath the rock shelf, with a hearth, wool rugs for sleeping, boxes of provisions, and even a brace of rifles leaned up against the wall. You did all this? I said. Oh yes, said Piao with a satisfied chuckle. Very strange, these ruffians. They'll face down whole armies, but start playing the fool, and they won't lay a finger on you. I can go anywhere, get anything I want. Very useful. Yes, very, very useful. So wait, you're not... I stopped myself too late. Not what? Said Piao. Nothing, I mumbled. Come on, say it, said Piao. It's really nothing. Say it. Not mad? I said, the word sticking in my throat. At this, Piao began to laugh, a breathy, careless giggle like that of a child. Sitting cross-legged on his sleeping rug, he began to rock back and forth, head cradled in his hands. No, he said, flashing a lopsided smile. No, I'm mad all right. No doubt about that. They say it's the concussion of the shells. They say it scrambles your... With his finger he traced little circles around his temple. So out there, I said, thoroughly confused. That wasn't... Out there, said Piao. Oh, yeah, yes, of course. Just a little play acting, not like... Once more he buried his head in his hands, heaving and shuddering for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to. It comes over you. You can't... How to explain? It's like sneezing. Yes, you feel it coming, but you can't stop it. It's just... on you. And then it's over, and you can't remember a thing. It's a blank, a gap, like a nightmare you knew you had, but can't quite remember. Watching this wretched man sobbing like a lost child, I realized how wrong I had been. This was no rabid dog prowling the camp for scraps, but a castaway, lonely and half-mad like old Ben Gunn. He even had a cave of treasures hoarded away. I half expected me to ask for a piece of toasted cheese. It's all right, I said, extending my hand. Piao recoiled, then warily leaned forward and shook it. Well, he said, glancing about him, it seems I'm being a terrible host. I'll put on some tea. With the same nervous energy with which he did all things, Piao began rooting through his store of looted provisions, and within minutes had a fire lit and a kettle on the boil. So, Edouard, he said, returning to his rug, you say you're from the Richelieu. How did you join the crew? You don't look like a legionnaire. I'm a stowaway, actually, I said. I came aboard at Dundee. It's a long story. And let you stay, said Pierre. Would have thought they'd have thrown you overboard. Because of my Morse, I explained. I used to operate the wireless on my father's lighthouse, you see, and Jacques. My voice suddenly choked off. To my relief, the mention of Jacques provoked no reaction. Pierre continued to calmly prod the fire. Did he even remember what happened, I wondered. Let me guess, said Pierre. He used you to cheat at cards? I blinked. How did you... Pierre smirked. I used to do the same for him. We won a lot of cigarettes in the trenches, and a lot of enemies. Until, of course... Pierre's voice trailed off, his eyes growing glassy and distant. His prodding became erratic, mechanical, sending embers spilling over the side of the hearth. The madness was returning. I sprang to my feet, preparing to flee, but after a long spell of shaking and sobbing, he once again regained his senses. Well, anyway, he said, wiping his eyes, let's just say he's always been a bastard. I nodded, and we spoke no more of Jacques. So, said Pierre as he poured me a glass of tea, where are they now, the crew? Ivan and Terry are here, I said. They're hiding just outside the village. And the others? I don't know, I said. We were captured on the beach, same as you. What about Stéphane? Pierre blurted. Did you see him? Is he all right? I hesitated. Amid the chaos of the fight on the beach, a memory flickered of Stéphane Doré, the scarred man, falling to the sand, felled by a stray bullet. I don't know, I said. Pierre slowly nodded, then shook his head, chuckling wistfully. Always getting into trouble, Steph, he said. But he always did manage to get out of it in the end. Well, except for joining the Legion. Yes, I said. Awful what happened to him. A long silence followed. So that wireless, I said. I've never seen one like that. How does it work? Are you sure you don't know? Pierre pressed. No, I'm sorry. Please think, Pierre pleaded. I remember seeing him on the deck. I remember that. I remember the captain, what they did to him. After that, I don't know. I'm sure he's all right. Truly, now... But Pierre wasn't listening. Shaking his head and muttering to himself, he reached to the bag at his side and withdrew a long smoking pipe in a small leather pouch. With shaking hands, he opened the pouch and reached inside, but after a few moments of fruitless digging, he frowned and turned it over, letting a few stray flakes of tobacco flutter out. With a frustrated grunt, he flung the pouch to the ground. Suddenly, I had an idea. Here, I said, reaching into Sean's bag. I've got something. Pierre eyed me curiously as I handed him a bandage tin. What's this? Sean called it keef. It's a... Oh, I know what it is, said Pierre, his eyes widening with delight. Ravenously he pried open the tin, jammed a wad of keef into his pipe, and set a match to it. He sucked greedily at the stem, his eyes rolling back in relief, and for the second time that day the man before me was transformed. His taut, sinewy body relaxed, his trembling hands fell still, and his frightened eyes grew tranquil and clear. Where did you get this? He said. It's Sean's, actually. I didn't realize I'd... Sean? The American, I explained. Or the medic. The one with the long hair. Ah, yes, said Pierre. That radio, I tried again. How does it work? I've never seen one like that. It's a crystal set, said Pierre. Haven't you used a crystal set before? No. At Pierre's beckoning, I pulled the radio from my bag. His spindly fingers darted about the plank, landing at each component in turn. Normally you have a crystal, a piece of galena. Here, he said, pointing the razor blade. And a little spring, the cat's whisker, and you touch to the crystal, search around until you find the right spot, the spot that rectifies the signal. The blade does the same thing. The blue coating on the steel is like the crystal, and the pencil lead is the whisker. And to tune the signal, you just adjust the coil. As I followed his finger around the circuit, memories of diagrams in Father's books came trickling back to me. It wasn't long before I realized something was off. Wait, where's the condenser? I asked. You do know your stuff, said Pierre, beaming. The whole circuit acts as a condenser. And the battery? That's the beauty of the thing. The circuit draws its power from the radio waves themselves. Can I try? Pierre nodded and led me back to the first shelf, where he reconnected the aerial and earthing wires. Per his instructions, I laid my finger on the safety pin, bursts of static crackling through the headphones as I swept it gently across the razor blade. But every time I halted on a signal, the pin slipped a hair's breadth, and the signal was lost. Again and again I tried, but the magic contact remained stubbornly elusive. After many long, fruitless minutes, Pierre took over, and when he finally handed back the headphones, I heard voices speaking French, clear and crisp as on Belle Rock or on the Richelieu. Contrôle, vol 57, en Passifran. Compris, vol 57, avez-vous trouvé l'épave de Morane? Contrôle, oui, 20 km sud d'Ifran, pas de signaux. Wait, I said. I've heard this before. It's an aerodrome. Pierre pressed the headphones to his ear. Yes, he said, nodding. Sounds like Aeropostale. Aeropostale? They fly the mail, Pierre explained, across the Atlantic and then to Rabat, but... He fell silent, brow knitted in confusion. But what? It's too strong, said Pierre. They're based at Cap Juby, that's 700 kilometers away. This signal is closer, much closer. Could there be another aerodrome nearby? Nothing I've ever heard of, said Pierre. It would be suicide in this part of the reef. He fell silent, a dozen emotions flashing across his face as he grappled with this strange enigma. But it has to be, he finally said. It has to be close. How close, I said. Pierre shrugged. 100 kilometers? Maybe 2? Is there any way to tell what direction it's coming from? Pierre scratched his chin and thought a moment. Yes, he finally said, snapping his fingers. Without another word, he reached to his bag of electrical scraps and began to twist and plait together various lengths of wire, fashioning a loop perhaps 2 feet in diameter. Once finished, he scrambled to the top of the hill and connected the loop to the end of the long aerial wire. All right, he said, holding the loop over his head. Tell me when the signal is strongest. As I pressed the headphones to my ear, Pierre slowly turned in place, sweeping the antenna through all 4 points of the compass. It took several revolutions before I was certain. Stop! Right there, I called. Northeast, said Pierre, gazing off into the distance. Well, I'll be. Are you sure it's nearby? It has to be, said Pierre, climbing back down, or else the mountains would block the signal. 100 kilometers, I said. How long would it take to get there? 3-4 days walk, maybe, traveling at night, said Pierre. 2 days by horse. So we could get there, I said excitedly. Find a plane, fly back to Hueta. What? Said Pierre. What do you mean, get there? Escape, of course, I said, gesturing to the pile of supplies. Isn't that what all this is for? Escape, said Pierre, sitting down by the fire. With newly trembling hands, he snatched up his pipe and took a long, desperate drag on the stem. Oh, no. We can't escape. What? I said. Why not? You said it's only a few days away. A few days anywhere else, said Pierre, but not here. The camp has no walls, no barbed wires, yes? It doesn't need any. The Bled is a prison. No one can survive out there. You can't carry enough water. We used to do that in the Legion with the whole baggage train, and we always nearly died of thirst. What about on a horse? Or a camel? No, said Pierre. Those Riffians are masterful horsemen. They'd hunt us down within hours. But you can't just stay out here, surely, I protested. Why not? Said Pierre with a lopsided grin. I'm mad, aren't I? At least, that's what they think. No, they'll leave me be. I have food, I have water, I have my radio. But don't you want to go home, I said, feeling that all too familiar pang of dread. Back to France? Ivan and Thierry are out there. All of us together, we could make it. It's not so bad out here, you know, said Pierre absently. I like it. It's open. I can breathe. Pierre, I said. Pierre? I called his name again and again, waving my hand in front of his face, but he continued to stare vacantly into the distance, rocking gently back and forth. So I left him where he was and started back towards the village. After all, he was of no further use to me. All I needed from him lay on the other ledge. But before I could navigate my way back to civilization, I had first to master the delicate art of tuning the receiver. Kneeling before it, I laid my finger on the safety pin and with the greatest delicacy I could muster, eased it across the surface of the blade. Again and again, brief strings of Morse flashed over the headphones, only to be lost the moment I halted my finger. I traced the contact until the blade was slick with greasy black lead and the sun began to graze the mountain tops, before giving up in frustration and hastily packing the radio into the haversack. I'd have to master this skill on the run. For a moment I wondered how I would find my way back to the village, so frantic and winding had been the chase to Pierre's hideout. But I needn't have worried, for I heard the village long before I saw it. The roar of hundreds of voices, wailing horns, and the crack of rifles echoed down the valley, and as I crested a hilltop overlooking the village I gazed down upon an astonishing scene. A large crowd had descended on the tent city, packing the flanks of the broad avenue. As a blast of horns pealed out, a line of horsemen swathed in colorful robes thundered down the avenue. On reaching the far end, they dipped their rifles in perfect unison and fired, unleashing a billowing cloud of white smoke. A great cheer arose from the crowd as the horsemen wheeled about, rifles raised in triumph. Casting my gaze at the village, I found its streets utterly deserted, and suddenly an idea came to me. My plan had been to skirt around the village and rejoin Ivan and Thierry on the hill, then strike out under the cover of darkness to gather horses and supplies. But with the whole village distracted, I realized I could pilfer the supplies myself, winning us more precious hours of darkness in which to escape. Plan in hand, I wound my headscarf over my face and started down towards the village. My first target was the hospital tent, and though the camp was packed with hundreds of Riffians, all eyes were fixed on the spectacle in the square, and I slipped through the crowd unopposed. To my surprise, I found the hospital deserted, with Sean nowhere to be seen, and grinning ear to ear beneath my headscarf, I crept to the supply table and stuffed my bag to bursting. Suddenly I heard a loud cry behind me and whirled around to see the young woman, Safia, tossing and moaning on her stretcher. I rushed to her side and began stroking her hair as I'd seen Sean do, gently whispering in her ear in a bid to quiet her screaming. It was then I noticed the skin around her dressings had turned bright red and blistered. She was getting worse. In the end, my efforts to calm her proved futile, and I slipped out of the tent before I could be caught. I was nearly halfway across the camp when I was struck by another realization. My next port of call was the village itself, where I could gather food from the houses, water from the well, and rifles from the armory. But it occurred to me that Pia already had these things safely packed away in his cave. Why not gather our supplies there, I thought, and only enter the village to steal horses? Electrified by this thought, I quickened my pace and headed for the edge of the camp. For the first time in weeks, home felt within reach. I could almost taste the salt air, hear the cawing gulls, feel the... Edward! I whirled around, my eyes darting about until at last they found the source of that hoarse cry. At the edge of the camp, a man hung by his wrist between two poles. He had been stripped to the waist and flogged, his back crisscrossed with deep bloody gashes. From his pale skin and the puttees around his legs, I knew it could only be one man. Edward, Sean croaked as I approached. Get over here, cut me down. What happened? Doesn't matter, cut me down, will ya? I glanced warily about me. Out at the edge of the camp, I was completely exposed. If I lingered much longer, I would surely be spotted. So I carried on towards the hills, leaving Sean behind. Hey, come back! Get back here, Sean called. I can't, sorry, I said. Hey, Sean barked, cut me down or I'll shout. I whirled around and shot him a glare. You wouldn't. Try me, said Sean. I'll tell them all about you and your French buddies waiting outside. Good luck getting out of here then. Time stood still as we stared each other down, neither man daring to blink. Then in the distance I saw a warrior emerge from the crowd and storm towards us, shouting and gesturing for me to get away. Like a good Riffian boy, I obeyed and started back towards the village, watching the warrior out the corner of my eye. When at last he turned and rejoined the crowd, I doubled back, found a sword in a nearby tent, and used it to cut Sean's bonds. The instant he was free, he wrenched the haversack from my grip and began frantically rooting through it, sending rolls of gauze flying everywhere. What is this? He said, pulling out the radio. A radio, I said, to find my way home. Ignoring me, Sean cast the radio aside and continued to dig through the bag. Where is it? He growled, throwing the bag to the ground. Where's what? My bag, said Sean, seizing me by the collar. What did you do with my bag? His eyes were wild, burning with manic fire. I ducked down and slipped out of my burnous before scrambling away, but to my horror Sean turned towards the main avenue and made to call out. Stop! I cried out. I don't have it. Cal does. He's got a camp outside the village. It's there. Shit, Sean cursed, turning round and round as he scratched at his arm. I need that bag, you understand? You're going to take me to that camp. Why? I said. Why do you... Doesn't matter, Sean snapped. Either I get that bag or neither of us is getting out of here. But I thought you didn't want to leave. Well, I changed my mind, all right, said Sean indignantly. Now let's get out of here. I hesitated. I didn't trust this American. Like Jacques, his sudden mood swings, his casual cruelty and indifference spoke of something sinister lurking beneath that boyish face. Hey, he said, do you speak Riffian? You're to need me out there. Now let's go. I had no choice, it seemed, but to accept this uneasy alliance. As with Ivan and Thierry, my only hope was to exploit his aid until the moment I could strike out on my own. Use him as I had been used so many times before. With a quick nod, I set off once more towards the hills. Hey, where are you going? Sean called after me. To Ivan and Terry, I said. They're up there. We'll all slip into the village at night and get the horses and camels, then to Piau's camp for supplies. Come on. Wait, said Sean, limping after me. That won't work. What? Why not? Don't you see what's happening? Said Sean. They're all riding out tonight. By the time the sun goes down, there's not going to be any horses and camels to steal. No, we gotta go now. I confess I hadn't thought of this, and at once I realized Sean was right. Right, I said. Then we meet up with Ivan and Terry. And we get my bag, Sean insisted, retrieving his tunic from the ground. The blood from his lashes quickly soaked through the fabric, but with no time to bandage his wounds, we set off for the stables. We had taken barely 10 steps when the rumble of the crowd suddenly faded away, and an eerie silence fell over the camp. Sean seized me by the arm and pulled me behind the nearest tent. Peering around the corner, I saw a figure standing on a platform high above the crowd. He was an unremarkable-looking man, short and barrel-chested with a round face and wiry black beard. Dressed in a plain white burnous and turban, had I passed him on the streets of Hueta, I would not have given him a second glance. But up on the platform he projected a regal, commanding presence, and when at last he addressed the hushed crowd, his voice rang as clearly across the camp as the cry of a muezzin from a minaret. "Who is that?" I whispered, turning to Sean. "What do you mean, who is that?" he said, frowning. "That's El Krim." I glanced up in astonishment. "What's he saying?" I said. Sean cocked his head, and after a few minutes began to mutter a translation. "Our struggle has been long and hard fought. We have endured much hardship, but our suffering is almost at an end. We have lived among the colonial powers, worked for them, seen into their minds, their hearts. They are people of leisure, of ease and decadence. They do not know sacrifice, determination, what it is to truly love one's country, one's people, one's God. We must continue to harass them, to show them that we will not lay down and be enslaved. In time they will lose the stomach to resist us, for even a lion, regal and mighty as he may be, will shy from a fight if a thorn is lodged in his paw." A great cheer erupted from the crowd, but at the wave of El Krim's hand they fell silent once more. "And we have reason to believe we will soon be victorious," he continued, "for I have just received news that our great enemy, Captain Ernesto Barra, is dead, slain by the hand of one of our greatest warriors, Fatima Alamin, who gave her life carrying out this heroic deed. May we never forget her sacrifice, or that of all other martyrs to our cause. May they dwell forever in paradise." "Poor Madame Fatima," I said, feeling my heart sink. "Who?" said Sean. I shook my head, fighting back tears as El Krim continued his address. "But we cannot win if we as Berbers remain divided. Unity is the only path to freedom. This is why tonight we ride to the camp of El Rasuli to extend the hand of brotherhood and unite our people. United, we will be unstoppable, and God willing, we will build a free nation for our children. We ride at dusk. Let the Turida continue." As the crowd erupted into a chorus of cheering horns and gunshots, Sean hastened me away towards the stables. They were nearly deserted, with a handful of grooms tending to a dozen animals. "Don't say anything," Sean whispered, striding with purpose down the aisle. "Just follow my lead. Hold out the bag when I ask you." He spoke a few words in Riffian to the grooms, who stepped aside and beckoned him into the stall. Like a good assistant, I held out Sean's bag, from which he plucked a handful of instruments before approaching the nearest horse. While the grooms looked on apprehensively, peered into the beast's mouth, shone a small torch in its eyes, and pressed a stethoscope to its flanks. His hands trembled as he worked, but he managed to keep his nerve. His examination complete, he shook his head gravely and spoke a few words to the grooms. Immediately they rushed to the stalls and hastened all the animals out the door, leaving only a single horse and camel. I gaped at Sean in astonishment. "What did you say to them?" "That these two were contagious and needed to be quarantined," he said, leading the horse from its stall. "Come on, they'll be back any minute. Get that camel and tie his lead to my saddle." I nodded and sprang into action, marveling at the genius of Sean's ploy. I have said before that camels are awful, cantankerous beasts, and this one was no exception. It fought me tooth and hoof, nearly biting my fingers off as I struggled to drag it from its stall. But with great effort I managed to tie off its lead and hoist myself into the saddle. With a kick to his horse's flank, Sean set us trotting out of the stables, and on towards freedom. But we had barely cleared the door when Sean's horse suddenly whinnied and reared up, flinging him to the ground. I let out a laugh, but suddenly felt my voice strangled as I saw this hulking figure of Redbeard standing directly in our path. With a kick to its flanks, I sent my camel bolting off, but immediately its lead went taut and I went pitching over the saddle. Winded and dazed, I gazed up in horror as that dark, menacing face loomed over me, the curls of his red beard burning like tongues of flame in the fading evening light. He seized my collar and wrenched me to my knees, then shoved my brow into the dirt. Beside me I saw Sean bent over in the same position, eyes bulging with terror. Suddenly, the gaping silence of the stables was shattered by the sound of a sword being drawn. In that frozen moment, as Redbeard raised the shimmering blade over his head, all my thoughts crystallized upon a single question. What did it feel like to be beheaded? Would it be only a slight pinch, a sudden coldness followed by blackness? Or would my consciousness persist for a moment, granting my dying eyes a final glimpse of my body as my head plummeted to the ground? The answer, whatever it was, would come soon enough. I strained my ears for the fall of the blade. But the sound that reached my ears was not the faint whistle of a blade slicing the air, but a peal of manic laughter. Glancing up, I saw a pair of dirty, bloodied feet in torn trousers gallop up and plant themselves between me and Redbeard. Without a moment's hesitation, Pierre Dory took the confounded Riffian's hands in his and spun him round in a merry waltz, gaily humming and laughing all the while. "Edward, go now!" he cried. Shaken from my daze, I rose and clambered back onto my camel. "Sean, get up," I called, but the American remained kneeling on the ground, frozen in terror. I kicked at my camel's flank, but again its lead grew taut, and the two beasts fell into a savage tug of war. Meanwhile, Redbeard had broken free of Pierre's embrace and brought the pommel of his sword crashing down on his head, sending the madman staggering back. He whirled around and slashed wildly, the blade whistling a hair's breadth over my head. I dropped to the ground and rolled beneath the camel, but in the midst of its struggles it galloped away, leaving Redbeard and I facing each other across the narrow aisle. As Redbeard slashed, I leapt back, keeping just beyond his reach, but he was driving me back into a horse stall, into a dead end. Frantically I glanced about, searching for a weapon, a shovel, a broom, anything. As I retreated into the stalls, my eyes landed on a horseshoe hanging from a nail on the wall, and brandishing it before me, I dropped into a fighting stance and stood my ground. Redbeard laughed cruelly, amused by this pathetic show of bravado, and raised the sword high over his head. The blow landed inside the horseshoe, grazing my fingers and drawing blood. By reflex I wrenched my hand away, snapping the blade cleanly in two. Redbeard froze, gaping at his shattered weapon. But a moment later he drew a curved dagger from his belt and lunged. Bang! Redbeard stumbled, halting mid-lunge. As his head swiveled round in confusion, more shots rang out, his great bulk shuddering with each report. When 6 shots had been fired, his eyes rolled back in their sockets and he collapsed in a heap on the ground. Behind him stood Pierre, pistol clutched in his trembling hand. Dropping the weapon, he clapped his hands to his head and collapsed to the ground, moaning and shaking as he slipped into another fit. Sean stood by the stable door, peering warily outside. As I emerged from the stall, he ducked back into the stable and began wrangling the horse and camel back under control. "Come on," he called after me. "The Fantasia just ended. They're heading this way." I dropped to my knees and laid my hand on Pierre's shoulder. "Come on, Pierre," I urged him. "We're getting out. Just get up and we'll be free." But the moment my hand touched him, he lashed out in terror, sending me stumbling backwards. "Hey, what are you doing?" called Sean, having finally brought the bucking horse under control. "Come on, let's get the hell out of here." I looked down upon Pierre's moaning, writhing body, Jacques' words ringing in my ears. Every instinct told me to leave him, that he had served his purpose, that he was nothing but a burden. The rolling hills bathed in lilac twilight beckoned just beyond the stable door. Freedom was only a short ride away. But without maps, all hopes of escape hinged on Pierre's radio, and my ability to master its secrets. But what if I couldn't? What if the device broke? No, I couldn't leave Pierre behind. I still needed him one last time. But he was in no state to travel. Even with Sean's help, I could never wrestle him into the saddle. It was then I spotted the bag slung over his shoulder. Immediately I reached in and began packing Sean's pipe with Keith. "Hey, you deaf or something?" said Sean, storming over. "We gotta—" Suddenly he lunged for the bag and wrenched it from my grasp. "What the hell are you doing, huh?" he said. "Come on, let's go." "Wait," I cried. "We can't take him like this." "What?" said Sean. "Leave him. Can't you hear them out there? We gotta get out of here. But we can't just leave him." "We can if we want to get out of here alive," said Sean, storming back to the animals. "What kind of medic are you?" I cried, halting Sean in his tracks. He stood there for an age, glancing from Pierre to the door and back. But as the roar of the crowd rose to meet the pounding in my ears, he grunted and stormed into the stables. "Fine," he said, tossing the bag at my feet. With Sean pinning the thrashing Pierre to the ground, I held a match to the pipe bowl and pushed the stem into his mouth. Stubbornly, he snapped his jaws shut, and only by pinching his nose did I persuade him to take a few puffs. Grimacing at the foul smell, he jerked his head away, but after a moment he relaxed and took the stem between his lips. Soon his struggles subsided and his body went limp, and at last we were able to lift him onto the camel. I sat behind him, arms wrapped around his waist, as Sean mounted his horse and set us trotting out the door. The camp was a scene of chaos, with hundreds of villagers dancing and cheering while mounted warriors rode between them, shouting war cries and firing their rifles in the air before galloping off into the darkness. Amid this revelry we passed unnoticed, calmly trotting to the edge of the village and slipping away into the night. Within minutes the lights of the village vanished behind the crest of the hill, and we were free of that accursed place forever.